This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs.
It is my pleasure to begin the next session by introducing Victor Asal from the University at Albany, which when I was a student was the State University of New York at Albany without the Rockefeller College, etc. But there you go, things have changed.
We're much more special than we used to be. So I'm going to use the microphone because I like to move when I talk, and because that way I can point at the PowerPoint. I want to preface this by saying that I'm going to be talking about the issue of defining and operationalizing terrorism, first from a normative perspective and then from an empirical perspective. And I'll just preface this by saying that one of the really great things about being an academic who does things quantitatively is that I get to affirm what I believe to be true, and one of the really annoying things about being somebody who does quantitative analysis is I get to disconfirm what I believe to be true. But I think that's very important, because on more than one occasion I've said, well, this hypothesis is clearly correct, and it turns out it's not. And that's frustrating. And this paper is going to show you one of those frustrating moments. I will say that in terms of terrorism, I come with a bias that I think killing civilians on purpose is generally a bad thing. Killing people in general, not great. Killing civilians on purpose, whether it be governments or individuals, I'm not crazy about. What I'm going to start with is I'm going to start with a presentation of two analyses that I've done previously that really were what led into this analysis that I'm doing for the conference. But I think that they're, especially after yesterday and today's presentations, I think they're very relevant. I hope you believe so as well. And does it make a difference to make a distinction between terrorism and other kinds of violence? And I would argue that it actually does make a difference. Normatively, there are those who argue that terrorism, we shouldn't really make these distinctions. You do what you need to do in order to achieve what you need to do, and that's just the way it is. And there are others that say that terrorism has what Cody calls a fundamental component of moral revulsion. Okay, and that's why people don't like this idea of killing civilians, this component of moral revulsion. And there are lots of arguments about which direction this should go. We'll be talking about that in a little bit. But from the empirical side of things, it may be that I define terrorism one way and political violence or insurgency another way in terms of the acts. I'm not talking about the organizations, I'm talking about the behavior. There might be very good reasons to do that from a normative perspective to draw that line. But from an empirical perspective, are there differences? Are there explanatory differences for what explains targeting one type of group as opposed to targeting another type of group? And that's what we're going to explore here. We're going to explore the normative element in a minute, and then we're going to explore at the organizational level very briefly, and then I'm going to go, speaking even ever quicker as Michael looks at me, into looking at this at the country level, which is the analysis that I did for today's class. Sorry. I was teaching on Tuesday. I'm supposed to be in class right now. I want to point out, though, that this was done in very close collaboration with my graduate student, Rachel Levin, and Rachel really deserves a tremendous amount of credit for all of the analytical work that she has done on this. I want to note one more thing. We are talking here about violence of non-state actors, but I think it's very important to remember that there's this thing called violence by states against individuals. And if we define 9/11 as terrorism, right, what about Dresden? Now, I'm a big fan of killing Nazis for all sorts of reasons, but bombing Dresden, where 25,000 civilians are killed, and really not targeting military targets in much of this bombing, raises serious issues. So I'm not going to get into it, but I'm just raising it as something we should be thinking about. Some of the individuals here have thought about it a lot, but I think in the conversation on terrorism, we should be bringing that in more. So in terms of defining it empirically at the organizational level, there are some people who define capability, and John, this gets to some of the things you're talking about, insurgency. It's about capability. Okay? If you control territory, according to Sanchez-Cuena and de la Calle, if you're doing these attacks against the military, you're ipso facto not a terrorist because you have the capability. You're at that point where you're no longer a terrorist. If you're below that point, if you don't control territory, if you don't have the capability, then you are a terrorist. And then there's this other primary distinction that people make in terms of, well, killing civilians on purpose is wrong and so should be judged differently, and they're defining terrorism as if you're targeting civilians on purpose. And some work that I did earlier from this perspective is, let's take a look at this from a normative perspective and see how we feel about who we pick as terrorists or not terrorists. So I apologize to all the British people in the room, but if we pick 4 groups we all agree that we agree with, sorry, Anthony, so I think we can all agree. Does everybody know the Treblinka Revolt? So this was a Nazi concentration camp where the prisoners rose up, they killed guards, and some of them escaped. Most of them were killed later. They certainly used violence. They did not target civilians. Warsaw Ghetto was an uprising that almost everybody's heard about, where the Warsaw Ghetto rose up, killed soldiers. I actually did some research into this. There was no evidence of the killing specifically civilians. They really targeted soldiers. They held territory for a very brief period of time, but they did hold territory. Treblinka Revolt never held territory. John Brown, everybody knows John Brown, right? So John Brown, his goal, we all agree that fighting Nazis is a good cause, right? So we agree on the cause? Okay, we all agree that slavery is a bad thing? Anybody going to disagree with me? Right, no, okay. So John Brown's cause was a good cause, but John Brown was a guy who went around slaughtering people on a regular basis who were doing nothing. He would go into a hamlet, he would pull out the adult males who were not fighters, who were just pro-slavery advocates, and he'd cut their heads off. Okay? He did this before Harper's Ferry. And then the American Revolutionary War guerrillas in the South. Okay, so we all agree the American Revolution was a good cause. We had to overthrow, get the British out of here, at least from an egocentrical American perspective. We're going to agree that they're a good cause. How many saw that movie by Mel Gibson, The Patriot? Okay, so that was based on Francis Marion. The thing that he leaves out in that movie is that Marion's forces would go around, and there were Native American tribes who were allies of the British. He would go into their villages, and he would slaughter everybody. Not just the soldiers, not just the men, but men, women, and children. He would slaughter everybody. And they definitely controlled territory. And this is where the distinctions come, and I think it's an issue of thinking about what are you comfortable with the definition. So if we define it as capability, so not controlling territory, non-terrorists because they control territory. So the American Revolutionary War guerrillas in the South and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, they control territory. So using the capability definition, they're not terrorists. Okay, even though the American revolutionaries are killing civilians. And terrorists, John Brown is a terrorist because he doesn't control territory, but the Treblinka revolts, revolting against the Nazis, are also terrorists because they don't control territory. Okay? And if we say that the issue is civilians versus not civilians, then the people who end up being the not terrorists are the Treblinka revolts and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and the people who end up being terrorists, even though we agree, most of us, with their objectives, are the American Revolutionary War guerrillas in the South and John Brown. And I think this is a very useful way to think about this because you have to say, am I comfortable with this division? If you choose capabilities, you're going to be ending up with these kind of results. If you choose civilians versus non-civilians, you're going to end up with different results. And I think having that distinction is important. When you get to operationalizing stuff, life gets complicated. I'm going to show you some analysis first I did of organizations. So there's a data set called the Normative data set. It's about 120 organizations from 1980 to 2004, ethno-political minorities in the Middle East. And what's unique about this data set in many ways, the only data set that's similar to this is NAVCO, which captures campaigns. Normative doesn't capture campaigns, it captures organizations. And some of them are violent and some of them are nonviolent. And so what it allows you to do is it doesn't allow you to just ask this violent organization, how does it use violence, but allows you to ask, why does an organization start using violence in the first place? And this is from a paper I did with Mitchell Brown and Marcus Schultzke. And we operationalize terrorism as targeting civilians. And so we did the analysis. We said, well, if you're going to kill civilians, you've got to be using violence in the first place. So we did analysis that looked at, do you use violence, and if you do use violence, do you kill civilians? Okay? And these are the results very briefly. And what's interesting here is that the things that predict violence and the things that predict specifically killing civilians are in some ways similar, but in some fundamental ways different. And so for both, if it's not a democratic organization, it's more likely to use violence and it's more likely to target civilians. The same is true for, and this is not a surprise being a Ted Gurr student, the same is true for state repression. Okay, if you oppress people, they're more likely to use violence and they're more likely to kill civilians. But then it becomes interesting. So organizational split, and there's a lot of literature here on the use of violence and internal strife within organizations, has an impact on using violence but does not impact the use of targeting civilians. Whereas controlling territory, which is important in terms of that insurgency component, makes you more likely to use violence, but it doesn't make you more likely to kill civilians. On the other hand, and I'm sorry Mark is not here anymore, but religious ideology does not have an impact, and this, by the way, conflicts with a lot of people's view of this. It doesn't have an impact on starting to use violence, but once you start to use violence, it makes you more likely to kill civilians, which gets into the whole cosmic war argument that Mark Juergensmeyer makes. So I think that at the organizational level, at least for ethno-political organizations in the Middle East, we're starting to have some part of evidence that seems to be a difference in just using violence in general and targeting civilians specifically, okay? But what about countries, okay? And this is the work that I did with Rachel Levin. So we're looking at country-level analysis. Operationalizing it, again, is really a pain in the neck. So first of all, for perpetrator, I'm going to mention again the state versus non-state. We're going to ignore the state for this analysis, but it's an important component. Territory and capability are often very hard to operationalize across a lot of organizations, and to attribute them to the state level can be problematic. The goal, when it comes to incidents, and this speaks, Richard, to what you were talking about before, in terms of the goal of the organization, you can get that, but the actual intent of every single act can be very, very hard. The actual goal of every single act in terms of scaring people can be very hard. What you can get to, and I think this is what you mean by intent, when you can get to is, what was their target? And if you're saying who are they trying to target, then you're not selecting on a priori type of organization, and it allows you to examine the difference between targeting civilians and targeting others. Okay? And so what we did here was we used the GTD, we used data from an aggregate database called Quality of Government, which if anybody does international, cross-national analysis, look at the quality of government. It will make your life much easier because it smashes all these data sets together. And we used independent variables that a lot of the literature suggests are key to explaining terrorism. We did this for 158 countries from 1972 to 2011. We did 3 analyses. We actually did a lot more than 3 analyses, but we did 3 specific dependent variables. Civilian targeting specific terrorist attacks, civilian and government targeted specific terrorist attacks, and all terrorist attacks, civilian, government, and security targeting within GTD. And we analyzed it for both incidents, i.e. how many of these events happened, and fatalities. Okay? And we use both negative binomial and zero inflated approaches for excess zeros, because there are lots of countries that have very little, almost no terrorism at all, so we had to take that into account. And we analyzed, like I said, both incidents and fatalities. Now, I can show you the results for each variable, but that's not what we're focusing on. What we're focusing on here is, are there differences? And this is where doing quantitative analysis can be really bad for your psychological health, because I was expecting more differences than we found. Okay? So I think I just said it. So the variables we used: regime type, economic performance, discrimination, regime durability, country population, and women's rights. Okay? And we were looking for what the differences were. Where were we finding differences? And overall, most of the variables we used, to my frustration, had the same impact, whether we did just civilians, whether we did civilians in government, or whether we did civilians, government, and security personnel all together. So every single variable except for one was having the same directionality, the same significance, and more or less the same impact on both incidents and fatalities. The one exception was GDP per capita and GDP per capita squared, where GDP per capita were civilian only and all targets were negative, but if you introduce polity squared, and we can talk about that, polity squared is a regime measure, it became almost insignificant, whereas if it was civilians and governments, it wasn't having an impact, okay? And if we did GDP per capita squared, civilians and all targets were not significant, but civilian and government positive was positive after we introduced polity squared. Again, so it's that combination of governance and GDP per capita was having an impact, but only for that variable, and they weren't the strongest results, except for targeting these civilians over here. Polity and regime were having different impacts on fatalities and incidents, but they were having the same across the board for only civilians, for governments, and also for military. Okay, does that, everybody with me so far? Yeah? Okay. So, and the other thing here is that when we try to figure out what might explain why we're seeing this difference with GDP per capita in the way that we are, maybe it's that extremely poor countries are more likely to have, and this was just on fatalities, right? It was just having an impact on fatalities. Maybe extremely poor countries are more likely to not be able to save the victims of terrorism, and extremely rich countries are more likely to report how many people get killed. But I think that's a pathetically bad argument. Okay, I mean, I don't think that's to me, it's not a convincing argument. We were trying to think of these different reasons about why it's happening at the two tail ends. And so, you know, is there some relationship between these kinds of countries which are extreme, where they're going to more target government officials than in the countries in the middle? I also don't see that as a compelling argument. So we need to do more theoretical work here. Now, in terms of we don't find very strong evidence for differences here. GDP per capita suggests that there might be some differences. We need to explore other variables. So if anybody has any suggestions for variables that might be making a difference between different types of violence, from civilians to everybody, please, I want to hear it because I want to include it. And we also think that what we need to do is, right now what we're doing aggregation. So just civilians, then civilians and government, then civilians, government, and security. And our next step is to do just civilians, just government, and just security to see if that makes a difference. Okay? And I think I'm all wrapped up, and I'm done. So who are you pointing at? So Judenrat was acting as a militia for the Nazis, and they were armed. Right. So some of them were, not a lot, but they were a militia for the Nazis. So these were Jews who were getting better benefits because they were helping the Germans run the. They were collaborators.
So one of the things we found when we were coding all of the attacks by women suicide bombers in Boko Haram is that, and this surprised me, that in some of these poorer GDP countries, they don't even register the names of the perpetrators, or it's not like what we do here where you'll, within the next few days, find out absolutely everything about Syed Farouk. But so part of it is that when you're talking about the differences, the GDP does impact the resources that the state, security apparatus have at their disposal. So for instance, they don't bother in Nigeria to identify I think there was over 315 female bombers, and they don't even cross-reference it to the the Kano girls who are missing. And so we don't know, for example, if the girls who were abducted, the 276, if any of them are actually bombers for Boko Haram. But they don't do what Western countries do in terms of having a complete file. So, I mean, the GDP affects it not in the sense of having more resources to be able to treat the wounded, but the GDP affects it in the entire way in which terrorism is dealt with.
Right. So the issue here, though, is explaining how it might be having an impact on different types of targets. So how it has an impact on violence in general, yeah, that makes sense. But it clearly is having a different impact on different types of targets. And the impact is it's having a bigger impact on the richer countries, a bigger impact on the poorer countries, and explaining that effect, that discontinuous effect, is an interesting challenge. Yes?
Victor, I want to ask you something out of ignorance of the data.
Yes.
It's been since 2010 since I've looked at the plots of the different types of attacks and fatalities, et cetera, using, and not GTT, but iterate.
Right. With
different set. But there's a characteristic of that set that raises questions for me in terms of why you might have found what you did. 50% or so of the events in the iterate set up until that point from the beginning have no casualty. More than 50% have no casualties, and 50% are unclaimed, and they're mostly bombings, most of which have no casualties as well. Okay, so if we have this enormous percentage of the events which have few casualties as a matter of course, how does that distort the possibilities, given in terms of how are they distributed? What's left? How is that distributed across these countries? And of course, a good deal of, you can make various inferences. Why did the bombings not cause casualties? One is that they can be done purposefully for that. I mean, the intent is to blow things up, but not necessarily kill people, and that's very careful. And that will, of course, depend on where the sites are that are being bombed. Secondly, they may not be terrorists. We don't know because nobody's ever claimed them. Nobody's ever has been seen as culpable. They've just been assigned. Okay. So does the data that you're using take account for that kind of skewing of the distribution of events?
So, well, so there are two questions you're raising here. One is an issue of claiming responsibility, and a huge percentage of GTD events are not claimed. I think 47% are not claimed. Right, 47%.
More or less the same as the.
Right. And the answer to your question is unattributed. Right. Okay. Right. And so the answer I have to that is I don't know. Right? Now, the other question, which I think is interesting, which we can take a look at, which is how is it impacted where you have all these terrorist events where there are no casualties? That I would have to take I'd have to go back, and I think that's something worth taking a look at and seeing if we can control for that, if that makes a difference. That's somebody, Laura, can you write that down for me so I can remember to do it? Now, since you brought the issue up of distribution, so in terms of civilian and government incidents, so 78% of the data set is civilian, 12% of the data set is government, and then for all incidents, civilian is 59%, government is 16%, security is 22%. Okay, so those are the breakdowns of the actual events in terms of when we were aggregating them up.
And by civilian here this is casualties or events that involve only civilians. So if I bomb a house, that counts as a civilian event, whether anybody is killed or not.
Right. This is incidents. I don't have the data up here.
This is not death. This is incident.
Incidents.
Yep.
Apparently, I've stunned everybody. Oh, good.
It seems to me to be quite surprising that the hybrid accounts for only 1%. It's really rare. And seems like, if you were just take a kind of a random overlap view, you'd expect a lot more than that. So I wonder what you make of this fact that it's so rare, the hybrid category.
I think it's a categorization issue in GTD. about how they're categorizing. I don't see it as a bad thing, but that's a data question which we can talk more about in terms of as a larger GTD data question than particularly this analysis. Any other questions?
Well, I will ask you a data question.
Oh, great. Okay, keep
So
asking.
which GTD data set is this the entire set, or is this a very carefully
No, this is
constructed?
the entire data set for divided up by how GTD has categorized certain incidents as civilian targets, government targets, security targets. Yes. It's from I believe the data we did was 1970 to 2012. Yes.
There, thank you. I was just wondering, in terms of the data, do you have the granular level to differentiate the perpetrators versus the victims in terms of their jurisdiction? Are the perpetrators in one country and the victims in another? And is that type of granular data available?
That's not in this analysis. Okay, there are things you can do to get at that, but that's not in this analysis. We weren't thinking about dividing up transnational versus domestic.
The problem is the large percentage
Thank you.
of unattributed attacks, so you really can't, for a lot of them, you really can't tell.
And
They're probably domestic.
right, the majority of attacks are definitely domestic. And by majority, I mean like more than 70%. Okay? I just want to note highlight an important finding here, which is at the organizational level, we're finding very strong evidence that targeting civilians is different than just regular violence. But interestingly, when we aggregate stuff up to the country level, that seems to be going away. Okay? And why that is a very important question. We're not sure what the answer to that question is. Any other questions?
No. Do you?
Oh yeah. So this is the organizational analysis. This is stuff that
but
we did for a previous paper.
This is aggregated organizational analysis.
What do you mean by that?
Well, this is all religious organizations within a country, or all religious organizations
So
across
the
countries.
unit of analysis in this data set is organization year. Okay, so the organization year of organizations in the Middle East that are ethno-political that claim to represent a MAR organization. Okay, so it's organizational year analysis for organizations claiming to represent a minority risk from 1980 to 2004. So that's the level of analysis we're doing it at.
Right. But that's not by organization. It is as a class of organizations.
No, it's by.
By single
No,
organization.
it's like single organization.
Okay.
Like literally, trust me, the joy of coding organizations at the individual level is about as much fun as ripping my fingernails off, but that's what I do for a living.
No, but what you're reporting here is not any. So we don't have the scatter plots of the organizations. We can't see the difference from organization 1 to organization 2.
We could.
I know you can, but you're not What I meant is you're not reporting that.
That is correct.
And the question becomes: Are there any peculiarities of any of these organizations besides their original designation,
Oh, yeah.
which requires a little more depth? I understand that.
Right. No, there are. Whenever you do any analysis, there's always at least some of the actors are going to be weird, right? And
Yeah,
so
those are the interesting ones.
Yes. Well, indeed. Okay. Great. Well, we're done?
Thank
Okay.
you, Victor.
Thanks.
And so I'm very pleased to present Lasse Lindekiller, who is both at Aarhus and a visiting fellow last year for the full year and sporadically this year at Orfala.
Okay, now to something relatively different from what we've been talking about earlier today. I would like to invite you guys to think and care about a particular type of terrorism, that is lone actor terrorism. In this project, we have looked at the radicalization of lone actors, and that's what I would like to share with you guys. First of all, I'd like to give credit to Stefan Maltana, my co-writer of the paper, who deserves a lot of credit for the work and for the paper, and not for the mistakes and unclarities in presenting it. I'll take full responsibility for that. So this paper is a first attempt to develop a relational approach to the study of processes of radicalization of lone actor extremists or terrorists. And what we try to do in this paper is to review and further develop already existent conceptualization and approaches from a relational perspective on radicalization, and adapting that to lone actor radicalization. And we in the paper try to illustrate our approach, and we think the value of the approach by some case studies. The main argument that this paper gives is that we can, by looking at relationships of lone actors in the process of radicalization, we can open up the black box of isolated self-radicalization, that we can get a handle on understanding that process better by studying these kind of transformations of relationships across time. We argued that lone actor radicalization varies significantly in how isolated their radicalization really is, and in terms of how they interact with other actors and milieus and settings across time, both offline and online. So we argue further, despite the diversity of radicalization of lone actors, we see some reoccurrent mechanisms that can help us to explain the process, as well as some reoccurrent patterns or pathways of radicalization, even maybe types of lone actor radicalization. But before I get to that, I just wanted to share this, which is from the same project where we also did a little bit of media coding, looking at how lone actor extremists are framed in the media, how they're constructed. And it speaks very clearly to what Lisa was talking about first thing in the morning yesterday, about, different perpetrators, different skin colors, even being framed in different ways. So what we can clearly see is that far-right perpetrators of lone actor events are mentally ill, whereas Islamists that do the same, they are framed in somewhat different ways. So the typical Islamist lone actor is framed as having a criminal past, a history of violence, isolated or even indoctrinated, whereas the typical far-right lone actor is framed as having a history of violence and mentally ill, having health issues. So those are interesting differences. The paper is not really pursuing those differences. It has to do with media biases that you were talking about yesterday. What we are interested in is how these different elements or categories reoccur as factors in the process of radicalization of lone actors. And we have a specific interest in the category of isolation. And what we argue is that, isolation is fundamentally a relational process, and we need to understand that much better to understand the phenomenon of lone actor radicalization. So we need to study that in more detail, and that is exactly what we've tried to do in this EU-sponsored project for about 1.5 years now. It's called PRIME. The project's basic idea is to try to script and analyze the full process or event of a lone actor extremist attack. So the radicalization part, the preparation of the attack, and the actual attack. Stefan and I has been in charge of looking at the radicalization bit of that, where we try to model or script using crime scripting methodologies to look at the script of lone actor radicalization. We do that based on a medium and database that builds partly on work by Paul Gill and John Horgan and others. We have 30 cases of lone actor attacks in the US, Europe, Canada, and Australia in the period from 1990 to 2015. This is built on open source data. We have cases with quite good data on relationships. That's why we chose these. We also have in-depth case studies, 6 of them from Germany and Denmark. So Stefan is German and I'm Danish, that's why. Where we have access to really, really in-depth qualitative material, police reports, documents, testimonies, and we've done interviews with convicted people of lone actor extremist events. All right. First, what do we mean by a lone actor terrorist? So it's an actor who has not been specifically handed the motivation to act, building on the intention motivation, who's not been specifically suggested that terrorism was an appropriate form of action in response to that motivation, or provided with the capability to act materially or psychologically by a group or organization or an individual formally linked to a group organization. So that's a lone actor terrorist in our definition. Yeah. So our starting point in the paper and in the project is to say, what do we know about radicalization as a relational phenomenon already? And there is a few approaches and studies that deal with this issue that has shown that radicalization initially very often has to do with social ties, personal pre-existing social ties that would enable a contact to some kind of radicalized settings or milieu. So that's one insight from the literature. Another one is that relationships, close relationships, socialization processes, and intensive interaction in radical milieus has a lot to say in terms of development of values, identities, and frames. And finally, small group dynamics of radical cells are hugely important in understanding very often the move from attitudinal radicalization to action preparedness. So we take these insights as our starting point and we try to adapt that to the study of lone actor radicalization. So the kind of conventional understanding of radicalization as a relational process is that, you have a friend that is inside a radical milieu, you become a part of that milieu. Within that milieu, you form groups that maybe separate yourself from the larger milieu, and you go on and do something. Yes. So our relationships relevant to lone actor radicalization, you could say that it's a bit paradoxical to study these loners in terms of relationships, but that's exactly our point, that isolation is fundamentally a relational status or situation. And there is also quite a bit of literature that shows that these actors are not that lonely. If you really dig into the data and the process by which they come to commit an act, their social ties seems to play a big role. And we argue that by doing this exactly, we can specify and explain these kind of mechanisms of self-radicalization much better, or even identify patterns or pathways, some types. In trying to adapt a relational perspective on lone actors, we have to do some adaptation because what we see is much less clear-cut patterns of connections, of increasing integration into a milieu or a group, or socialization processes that are kind of, straightforward, clear-cut. We see much more complex processes of connectivity that are discontinuous across time. You're embedded at some point, less embedded at a different point, so it's really more flexible. And we see varying combination of weak and strong ties and the importance of relationships having different functions. That's hugely important. So you can be structurally connected through social ties of some kind. Socialization happens through social ties, but it also shapes very often decision-making. And we can also see how protective social ties can have a protective function. Very importantly for the study of lone actor radicalization, we find a need to adapt and understand the link between social relationships and mental health issues. Because we know from a lot of studies that there's a clear overrepresentation of people with psychological problems that commit these kind of acts. So we have tried to conceptualize and theorize a bit about that link, how depression or some kind of other mental health issue may disable you from engaging in social ties and how that filters into the radicalization process. So we've tried to develop this analytical framework. We try to code relationships, weak and strong ties or medium strength ties across time. We have coded face-to-face relations and online relations as well for these lone actors, extremists. And we've, in that sense, charged the field of relation by looking at personal social environments, family relations, friendship groups, and relation at the school, college, or workplace. Relationships with what you could call radicalizing agents of some kind, offline as well as online. And that looks something like that. At a given point in time, these individuals in the center have more or less strong ties, weak ties to different kinds of settings. And what we've tried to do is to charge this across time for these cases. Yeah. In doing so, we have come up with a list of, very tentative at this point, but a list of mechanisms that we believe are reoccurrent, that can be identified across the cases, that help us to explain this chains of configurations of relationship across time. So what we see, for example, is that conflictive interactions with family and friends leads to some kind of isolation and isolated seeking. Isolated seeking then leads to integration into some kind of virtual online groups, very often some kind of milieu online that you then engage with. That kind of integration, less or more of embeddedness in these virtual groups, creates some kind of withdrawal from offline personal relations in many cases. We see again how these mental health issues lead to withdrawal from social relationships. That's part of the explanation of the isolation very often, that people's psychological traits simply disenable them to connect and prevents integration, further integration into offline or online milieus. We see what Clark over here has called unfreezing. Sudden unfreezing of social relations very often plays a role in changing these configurations of relationships across time. So episodes such as migration or travels or release from a correctional facility, from prison, is a relational situation where you are disembedded, and which is often linked to some kind of renewed seeking. We see how ideological reinforcement happens through weak links to establish radical milieus offline or online. And we have tried in the papers to conceptualize something that is often not really carefully theorized, I think, but often comes in to some kind of ad hoc explanation of radicalization processes, namely that there is a trigger. There's something that triggers an event or a change. And we argue that based on our data, what very often is that trigger is some kind of action encouragement cue. Indirectly, you read something, you are directed towards some kind of modular action that you see, which connects your attitudes and your willingness to act at a certain point in time. Wahoo. That's what it looks like. So we argue that these mechanisms here, they combine in a number of ways, creating various relational configurations over time, of which some seems to reoccur as pathways or patterns of radicalization. They have the same kind of underlying plot, we argue. And one of these plots is what we have termed in the paper the peripheral drifter pathway. It's a situation where one of these lone actor extremists, and we argue there's quite a few of this type, they stay at the periphery of certain milieus for different reasons. Some kind of crisis may lead to a withdrawal from personal social relationships. that leads to an engagement online. You consume radical material, you engage in certain forums, but you do so at the margins of that milieu. You never become a part of a group, you never really invest in the group, but you're around that group, you read their material. So there's a peripheral integration in the radical milieu, and at the same time a weakening of offline friendship ties, and then something happens. The trigger could be some kind of, in one case, a German case, the trigger seems to be a guy that consumes a video that supposedly shows women raped in Afghanistan. And he goes out quite spontaneously and does something afterwards. But he falls into this category or this pattern of the peripheral drifter. This is the same figure, the same kind of pathways, just spelled out with the mechanisms at the bottom, how we think we can explain this process more in depth, using this understanding of causality from a mechanistic perspective. Yeah, I don't think I have time to really go into that, but just present another type, another pattern, another plot that we see reoccurrent in our data. The isolated dyad pathway, so maybe again a little controversial, I would argue that a lone actor does not have to be completely lonely. We quite often see these kind of attacks carried out by two people. So maybe, that's an hypothesis, the Bernardino thing we just saw might quite well fit this pathway. I don't know, but we'll see. But it's a suggestion, it's a hypothesis that, you know, what we see sometimes in quite a few cases is something like this, some kind of unfreezing, some travel, migration, what have you, leaves people in a situation of very disembedded, loose embeddedness in certain milieus. They then find a very like-minded person and they interact closely. They form a cell that then disengage from a larger milieu, and they go on themselves and kind of radicalize each other in this kind of dynamic format of a close dyad. There are several examples of that in our data. Maybe the San Bernardino attack resembles some of this. All right. We suggest also a few other patterns we see emerging. There are very much work in progress, not really validated yet, but it seems quite clearly that there's something to do to these patterns as well. We talk about a failed joiner pathway, so an individual that really hardly tried to become integrated in milieus. He wants to form his own group, but for different reasons is rejected. Sometimes has to do with personality traits and other things. They're not able to integrate and then pursue alone at some point. A specific version of the failed joiner pathways I think could be termed blocked foreign fighting pathways. There are quite a few examples of that in our data where people really want to go abroad to Syria and do something. But for different reasons, they cannot. They don't have the resource, they don't have the connections, they don't have the social ties that'll make that possible. And then they do something at home instead. The crossover pathway, a pattern that comes across both with Islamists and far right actors in our data set, that you have a past, criminal past, so you cross over in that sense. You cross over for a criminal milieu relationships into a more politicalized, violent milieu. The Copenhagen shooter is an example of that. He was had a past as a gang member, was in prison, seemingly radicalized somewhat in prison, or at least he came out very disembedded. He was very alone when he came out of jail. And he crossed over into a different milieu, and then something happened. So, yeah. I think I'll leave it with that.
Thank you for a very valuable and sophisticated study. I'm a little troubled by the anchoring of it in the terminology of radicalization, because it seems to imply it's heavily associated with a political dynamic. You think of radicals as people that are, but many of these lone actors seem to me to be deeply alienated rather than radicalized, as those terms are. And I wonder if, I don't know the scope of your study, but I wonder if it wouldn't be helpful to say radicalization and alienation, or something that softens the political associations that the word radicalization has.
Yeah, I think that's a problem not just of our study, but using the term radicalization in general. I think Anthony was pointing to some of the troubles with this concept, and I totally buy that you can get blinded and not really see the political grievances that may lay underneath this, and it's a very politicized term.
Lone actors.
Yeah, but my point would be that exactly the kind of alienation you're talking about is part of the explanation of why some of these people end up radicalizing. So we need to understand exactly that interlinked dynamic between feeling alienated, finding some kind of discourse or narrative that helps you in understanding that and directing that alienation, and see how that filters into this process.
For instance, the Sandy Hook incident and the Colorado theater shooting, they seem to be individuals that had very little political content.
No, and that's often the case, that the politicization of their understanding of their alienation come in very late at this stage. I don't argue that. I think that's true. It often comes in as some kind of after reflection of a need and want to do something. Nevertheless, yeah, I would keep my focus on trying to understand exactly that interaction between the alienation and the radicalization of political beliefs.
Thank you very much for the presentation. The question I have is, in Paul Lejean's original study of the 119 lone actors, and Paul's now expanded it with Emily Corner to be over 215, 83, and this is consistent, 83% there was a bystander effect. 83% had informed somebody of varying degrees of the plot. Where does the fact that the bystander effect exists very significantly, statistically, where does that fall in the categorization of the alienation? Because in the way that you're portraying the model, they're moving away from family and friends, but we know from the data they are sharing this information with family and friends. So how can you fold that in, or how do you reconcile what seems to be almost opposing perspectives on how alone they really are?
In that case, I think I was not clear in what I tried to convey and say, because I work with Paul on this project, and we try exactly, I think, to show that, the bystander effects, these people are not that lonely. They interact and they share a lot of knowledge with people. I think, at least to some extent, the drawings should indicate that they are not that lonely. They are connected, but they do withdraw sometimes from some of the relationship and then convey message of what they intend and what they want to do online. That's quite often the case. So it's a matter of, I think, at what time.
Last cell that's confusing because you have it completely isolated. So it's the last part gives the impression that they're all alone.
Yeah, but that was not what I was trying to convey. It's just to indicate that often at that very last stage, they are disembedded to a larger extent that they are prior to it. So if you have a timestamp on when they communicate something about their intent, often it's prior, it's earlier. It's not right when they do it. Whoa.
How much damage did these guys do? How many people did they kill?
Well, Breivik is the exception. Normally, they're not that lethal. If Bernardino falls into the category, that's also an exceptional case. So they do less damage than group-based attacks normally.
So, yeah, Max Abrams looked at the 1,900 most destructive terrorism events, included that lone wolves, committed about 3 of them, or something like that. Did that seem to fit with what you're arguing?
Come again? I didn't get that.
Of the 1,900 most destructive terrorist acts, only 2 or 3 or something like that were committed by lone wolf types. Is that? I mean, they don't just. The point is that they don't do much damage.
No,
Right.
no, that's probably true. Nevertheless, authorities and media people and scholars care quite a bit about this for good reasons, because they are that much more difficult to detect and do anything about. So they pose a threat, but yes, not as lethal a threat normally.
Right. Even if they're successful, they don't do much damage. Breivik is an extreme outlier. Right?
And the first Paris attack, and there are a few others quite lethal ones.
Just as a corollary for John, I think it's sort of almost a tautology when you're alone versus when you're part of an organization. By definition, the organization is going to have more resources and ability to do something bigger. You couldn't, as a lone actor, plan 9/11. You could, as a lone actor, still kill lots of people. So I think it's a false dichotomy to assume that the lone actors aren't able to cause or wreak havoc, and especially depending on who they kill. And if, it's, as you said, the media will focus on some more than others. But by definition, organizations will have at their disposal the means and the planning and the resources, financial and otherwise, to do larger scale attacks. I think the problem is by looking at 1,900 of the biggest attacks, and then you just pull out the 3 that are lone actors, I think it's intellectually dishonest. I think that that's not the way we would approach it. We would approach it by comparing lone actors with groups within organizations in periods of time where, let's say, media existed or didn't exist. I think that, it gives the impression of science because it's 1900, but I think at the end of the day, it's just intellectually lazy.
What we try to do is exactly to, in the larger project, try to compare the processes that I've described here to more group-based radicalization, try to better understand both dynamics, and I think there's quite a lot to be gained from caring also by these guys, even though they're not that lethal. I think we can learn a lot from the patterns here in trying to understand both types of radicalization.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right.